Okay, so for our last part of this lecture for Chapter 19, we're going to look at the concept of fitness. And fitness is sometimes expressed numerically on a scale from 0 to 1, or 0% to 100%, and it represents the likelihood or the success with which a certain phenotype is associated with passing its alleles on to the next generation. And so when we assign or when we calculate a fitness, what we call the fitness coefficient, it's a number from 0 to 1, and where the most fit phenotype is assigned 100%, and then any lesser phenotypes are assigned a number less than 1 associated with how often they are able to pass on their alleles. But in any case, the general concept of fitness is, and we're not going to do the math, by the way, but there's a mathematical calculation to determine the fitness coefficient, but it is a number from 0 to 1 where 1 is assigned to the most fit situation in that scenario. But in any case, the individuals that have the highest fitness, that have the fitness of 1, are the ones that leave the most offspring to the next generation. And then individuals with fitness less than 1, like 0.9 or 0.5, those would leave less offspring to the next generation. And fitness really has two components. Survival, so that's important. The ability to hide from predators, the ability to get food and water, the ability to survive is part of it. And then the second part is then reproduction. Now, reproduction is really the more important part of this, because you'll notice the definition of fitness has to do with how many offspring are left in the next generation from that individual, or from that genotype or phenotype. And so reproduction is the most critical part of fitness, but survival is important if you're going to have a long reproductive life. But if I had to weigh the two, I would put reproduction more important than survival. So in the end, the game is to leave as many offspring as possible. And the longer you survive, the better chance you can have more offspring over a longer period of time. And then within reproduction, I've separated it out a little bit into some subcomponents. I could have subdivided survival into ability to hide from predators, ability to get food and water. For reproduction, the components would be the ability to attract a mate, and then also how many offspring you can have at a time, like in a litter, for example. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, but the most fit scenario would be an organism whose phenotype allows it to survive a long time, and it's able to attract a lot of mates and have a lot of babies every time. And so that would be the side of fitness that would be closest to 1. A fitness of 0, well, I don't think there is such a thing, but a very low fitness of 0 would be extinction, I guess. But fitness of like 0.1 or something like that might have a very short ability to survive, or have no ability or poor ability to attract a mate, or maybe not have very many offspring per mating, or all of the above. So really the least fit scenario would be doesn't survive very long, doesn't attract a mate very well, doesn't have very many babies. So those are kind of the two far ends of the spectrum of fitness, but most organisms, probably fall somewhere in the middle, or most phenotypes. So you have to think of fitness as having a lot of components. Now, let's say you have an organism that survives a long time, but can only have 1 baby a year. So let's say you have a scenario, because I want to show you how to compare scenarios just conceptually. Can't get my pen to go. Okay, so let's say you have an organism that lives 50 years, but can only have one baby a year. So the contribution to the next generation would be 50 babies. Let's say that you had an organism that survived only 25 years, but could have 3 babies a year. So the survival is less, but the reproduction per year is more. So overall, this would be more fit because there would be an overall more contribution to the next generation. So that's why I say reproduction really has a lot more importance in the end, because even if something doesn't survive as long, if it can have more babies in that time, it's still going to be the more fit situation. Or let's say you had an individual that only lived 10 years, but it could have 10 babies a year. Again, the survival is less, but reproduction overall would be 100 babies over those 10 years. That one would be the most fit. So survival helps, but reproduction ability is really where it's at. That's what's really key, is what is the overall contribution to the next generation. All right, on this slide, I'm going to give you some definitions and then some examples. Mainly what you're doing, this is kind of similar to when we talked about the barriers of reproduction. You might remember we did prezygotic barriers like habitat, isolation, gamete incompatibility. You probably remember those. Temporal isolation, behavioral isolation, and mechanical isolation. You probably remember those. And I gave you a definition for them, and then I gave you different scenarios, and you had to figure out which one of those fit. Which term fits the scenario. So in the same way, I'm going to give you some terms, types of selection, and based on the outcome, you can classify the scenario as either being what we call stabilizing selection, directional, and diversifying. So I'm going to use the scenarios the book gives, and then you can think about it. You know, any scenario that gives kind of that same outcome would be classified in the same way. Okay, so stabilizing selection, in these drawings you have sort of a bell curve of phenotypes and genotypes. The initial population is blue, the bell curve in blue. And then after selection, the end result is in red. So you kind of see what the general pattern is in these. Okay, so in blue, let's say the original population, this is stabilizing selection. In stabilizing selection, what you're looking for is that after selection, the population has a much more narrow range of phenotypes. It sort of tightens up along a median number. So for example, the original population, let's say birds have anywhere from 2 eggs to 10 eggs. So that's kind of this original span. So number of eggs that a bird lays. After selection, there's going to be a selection towards having kind of a middle number of eggs, a moderate number. And that's because if you have too few eggs, then you're not as fit because you're not contributing as many offspring to the next generation. If you have too many eggs, the problem is that sometimes the shell material is too thin on each egg, so some of the eggs will crack and die. Or it could be that the mother is not going to be able to get enough food to that many chicks, and some of them die. And so really the optimal situation is to have kind of a nice middle ground where you have, 5 or 6 eggs. Then there's enough shell material for each egg to be, the shell can be solid. There's enough food, the mom can get enough food to those 6 chicks, and you're contributing a reasonable number of offspring to the next generation. So stabilizing selection favors the middle ground more than either of the extremes. Or you could say that stabilizing selection is where the extremes are disfavored, and then by default the middle ground is favored. So there are some kind of negatives on either extreme of the phenotypes. So that's one. That's fairly common, stabilizing selection. The next one, this is the one that you are probably most familiar with, although we haven't used this term, but the term is directional selection. In directional selection, you have a population that has a certain phenotype, and they're showing peppered moths as a phenotype. These moths were the most prominent kind of moth in pre-industrial Europe, and they're kind of white and black a little bit. And then something changes in the environment, and suddenly, or not suddenly, but pretty suddenly, this is no longer favored, and then individuals who are, in this case, more solid black, which would be kind of at this extreme of the original blue line, suddenly are more favored, and so the entire population shifts in a certain direction. So you go from having mostly spotted moths to mostly solid black moths. So one of the extremes is favored, and the group shifts in that direction. That's very common. That's mostly what you see in evolution. That's what you see with the rock pocket mice. You know, they were mostly brown, but a few black, and then on the lava flows, the black ones were favored. So over time, the entire population on the lava flow is now mostly black. That would be directional selection. So the group goes in a certain direction, depending on what the selective pressure is. The last one is really rare. Honestly, they have to make up an example, and I can't even think of an example of this, but it's called diversifying selection. It's conceptually the opposite of stabilizing selection. In diversifying selection, and you'll notice even that they don't even have, and they spelled hypothetical wrong. Hypothetical. There's too many H's there. But in a hypothetical population, they couldn't even come up with a real example. So this is very, very unusual. So stabilizing selection, pretty common. Directional selection, very common. Diversifying, we're going to learn this one as an academic concept primarily. So let's say I make up an example where you have this population that kind of has this bell curve in the blue. And so most of the rabbits are white. On this extreme, there's a few that are black. On this extreme, there's a few that are black and white, whatever. And something in the environment favors both extremes. So favors this, and does not favor the white suddenly. So something would have to change in the environment that would favor both of these and not the middle. So instead of, like in stabilizing selection, the middle becomes more common. It goes the other way. The ends, the sides of the distribution become more common, and the average becomes less common. So you can see the middle goes down and the sides go up. That would be conceptually diversifying selection. So where the unusual is favored. So, you know, that you could see that, although, like I said, they have to, even your book has to make up an example, and I can't think of one either. So that's more of an academic consideration there. Okay. There's another type. This one's called frequency-dependent selection, where it's almost like frequency-dependent selection would be a scenario, maybe like a directional selection. So remember, on directional selection, you start with one group and then it shifts to a certain way. But what happens in frequency-dependent selection is if you wait long enough, it shifts back. Anything that kind of is on a pendulum, it swings back and forth between two different situations, is called frequency-dependent. And what it really means is when one group becomes too common, then suddenly that's not an advantage anymore. And so the rare group becomes more favored. And then as more and more become like that, then that becomes the more common group. And then the more rare is favored. So it keeps switching back and forth between what's favored. it's kind of hard to explain in words, actually. I think you want to read, and I'm going to use this example on the quiz anyway, so you want to read this one. This is in your book. This is one of those rare times when I'm going to tell you to go to chapter 19. I think it's section 19.3 in your textbook, and you can read about frequency-dependent selection, and there are these blotched lizards. And it's a bit of a complicated story, but you'll see how the population kind of swings back and forth between different blotch-throated lizards depending on what's the most common and what's the least common. And so this population really never reaches, a population that is subject to frequency-dependent selection really never, conceptually never reaches an equilibrium. It keeps changing back and forth, back and forth. So I'll let you read about that one, but that's a special case. Probably my favorite concept in evolution is called the evolutionary compromise. An evolutionary compromise would be a case, again, any case that's described where you have an individual, a trait, an adaptation that would be favored in one component area of fitness. You remember your component areas of fitness are survival and reproduction. But it's a disadvantage in the other area of fitness. So for example, this little frog was singing. I couldn't find a picture of him just singing. Well, I found a picture of him, but I wanted to get the bat in the picture. So imagine the frog was just on the ground singing. And the frog has a mating call, it sings. I don't know if you hear them. I hear them at night. Inside my house, I can hear the frog singing, if you know what to listen for. And the problem is it attracts a mate, hopefully, but it also attracts the predator. So which component of fitness is favored? It would be reproduction, attracting a mate. But which component of fitness is a disadvantage in this case? Singing attracts a mate, so it's favored for reproduction, but it also attracts a predator, so it's a disadvantage for survival. So that's weird, because you have one trait, singing, that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. In the end, because these frogs are still around and reproducing, we would assume, based on results, that the reproductive advantage outweighs the risk of death. We're making that as a guess because the frogs are still around. But it seems as if you see an evolutionary compromise, it seems as if the part that's favored must outweigh the negative implication. So it's like a cost versus benefit ratio. If any of you have studied business, cost versus benefit. As long as the benefit is more than the cost, as long as he can attract a mate several times before he dies, then it outweighs the negative. The benefit in this case outweighs the cost. Another evolutionary compromise we saw, did we see? No, we'll see it now, is called sexual dimorphism. This means di means two, and morph means forms. And sexual dimorphism is especially in animals where you have the male and the female look visually different. Now, in some animals, they don't. But if there is a distinct difference in the appearance of male and female, it's a case of sexual dimorphism. This is a peacock. It's the male, peacock. All right. And there's a peahen. That's the female. She does not have the long tail feathers. She is not as beautiful as the male. So the male, this is really extreme case of sexual dimorphism. The male is attracting the female with his display. It's kind of like, well, I'll give you some more examples. It's pretty common in birds, actually. The cardinal is a red bird, but the red one is the male. The female is usually kind of brown, maybe a little bit red, but not very bright. So the male has to attract the female. And so by looking visually different, there's an attraction. In other words, two males don't waste time trying to mate each other. Two females don't waste time trying to mate each other. A male can directly find a female. They know that they are the opposite sex, and they can mate. In spiders, it's pretty common for the female to be the big one and the male to be little. So that's a sexual dimorphism. And then in birds. Now, what's the evolutionary compromise? Well, survival. I mean, look at this thing. Look at this peacock. I mean, yes, he's attracting a mate, but he's also attracting a predator. So that's typically an example of an evolutionary compromise. All right, that's the end of our chapter.